think AI is something that's been coming for a long time. It's now here. It's here in a particular specific way in terms of usage. We've got mass adoption, kind of backdoored in through your enterprise G Suite or your Microsoft accounts. We've got a lot of companies now who have bought enterprise and ChatGPT or different derivatives. We've got other tools like code augmentation tools from Copilot, Cohere backed with their Claude models, etc. So I think what we've seen is, it's one of those 10-year overnight successes that's now here. But then there's always this piece that is coming soon. The summer blockbuster movie trailer is now is the agent piece. Like, how will agents assist or take over in certain respects? And so what we have is adoption has happened. As per usual, security is lagging, I think. And we're seeing the need for security have really serious conversations now. We're seeing major players make acquisitions in the space, signaling their intent and putting their money where their mouth is. And I think, unfortunately, we're also seeing a big surge in voices that aren't necessarily in a position to be in a meaningful place to talk about what they're talking about. So folks who don't work in AI talking about AI, folks who work in different, maybe adjacent spaces talking about it. And those opinions, whilst necessary to understand people's perspectives, aren't adding to the story, they're creating noise. And so it creates confusion, I think, for a lot of people in an already very difficult to understand space. So I see kind of this triangle of adoption and general usefulness, security, lagging behind to make that and protect that investment. And then this noise area, which is a mixture of FUD, I guess, and genuine. There's some pearls of genuine concern in there as well. And siphoning out the genuine concern from the noise is quite difficult and tricky because of the volume of noise. But that's always been the case in the security space. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Anthony.
Yeah, well, to go back to the question of like platformization versus point solution. The technologist in me wants a point solution. Right?
Interesting.
I want something that's best of breed. I want something that works in a deep, technical level at the highest sophistication. But the CISO in me wants a platform.
Yeah.
So it's a conflicted battle as we start thinking about the path forward, because I see efficiencies in a platform play, right? I get leverage from a negotiation. I get leverage from an overhead, maintenance, one less vendor to deal with and have to renew. So now how does that get kind of rolled into the larger AI picture? Well, I think we can look back at some other areas that have a lot of synergies. I think about like ASPM, application security management. And there was all these point solutions. It was, you needed something for SCA, you needed something for static code, and then you needed something for secrets, and then you needed something for container scanning, right? And then what you see in the big players just eat up all of those small companies and create a platform that goes very wide. So I think we need to see something like that happen with artificial intelligence security. And the reason being is that when as a CISO, as a buyer, I need to start thinking about stack ranking all of my features, right? What are the features I care about the most? And then I'm going to go look for a solution that can cover that entire gamut. But my decision buying process will be guided on the top two features I care about the most and who does that the best.
So let me challenge that with a hopefully interesting question. The space hasn't settled yet, so it's in it's the velocity is still very, very high, and maybe even accelerating. So would you say that you want point solutions while the velocity is still high, and then when it lowers or becomes static, then you want to look for a platform play? Or would you say, you want a platform play that's keeping track because it has that cross-cutting interest in all the various parts of AI? Which would you think is your preference there?
I think it's the later, right? Okay. Because at least if I can get observability across a lot of things, that's a big win. Even if the defense and maybe the offense isn't there in that particular vertical, I'd rather just have visibility to it than fly blind.
Okay. So one of the things that it's easy to ignore problems when you don't know about them, right?
Yep.
So when you've got visibility and you've got an idea of what is happening in your organization, or maybe even outside your organization from the outside in, attack vectors, etc., what is your top three things when you know there's a problem? What's your go-to budget reallocation going towards?
Yeah, I mean, for AI, it's a lot of net new, which I think is luckily an interesting space because the business recognizes that technology adoption isn't, linear in some ways. It's very much granular. It's going to grow in all these different use cases. AI is embedded in almost every department in my organization today. And I have to think about how do I get some eyes and ears into each of their use cases. We haven't seen, I would say, a platform in terms of like AI use. I think that's where maybe the struggle is coming from, like the lay of the land. There isn't a one AI tool to rule them all. To your point earlier, it's AI integrated into Workspace, into Office, into Confluence, into Jira, into Slack, right? There's all these AI implementations, but then how do you govern that at scale? From a security perspective, it's nearly impossible, right?
So let me switch gears. So we've heard this and seen it written in print media everywhere. Fight fire with fire, right? Yep. Where does your comfort level sit in AI adoption as a defensive mechanism, or even as a proactive threat hunter or something like that? How comfortable are you adopting AI technology to help you win this battle against AI dangers of threats?
Yeah, fight fire with fire is exactly the same mentality. Let's leverage AI to the fullest extent. I've seen some attacks against our web assets using artificial intelligence to bypass a lot of our CAPTCHAs and bot mitigation tools. They're scoring perfect human scores.
Wow.
And it's from the biggest CAPTCHA name that you can think of.
Yeah.
Right? And then when
they're really good at identifying taxis and lights and stuff,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. Crosswalks are really important. But they're not stopping these bots, right? Because they're using AI operators that mimic human behavior. But we see it all the way on the far end of the back end of like, we know this is a fake account, right? This is not a legitimate user signing up. But how do we get left with doing that? So we've been trying to think about how do we integrate AI into maybe our sign-up workflow and to be able to determine some of these key parameters that we figure out later in the sign-up flow from a consumer perspective earlier in the sign-up flow. And it's all being done through us orchestrating OpenAI confidence levels on some data points.
This is interesting. It's like that test, to identify if it's a robot or a person.
Yeah.
You're having a conversation, but now instead it's like, it turns out the AI is better at identifying the things that we thought were human specific. So it's like the behavior. How do you signify between human behavior versus artificial intelligent behavior? And that's an interesting but slightly skewed segue into agents, right?
Yep.
So as we see agents, and one of the big concerns out there with agent technology is identity, or the concept of identity changing. So, is an agent an operator type agent where it assumes an identity similar to a human, right? To a role more appropriately? Or is it a sentient agent where it doesn't assume by definition an identity, and it can roam both vertically and horizontally in your stack to do whatever right by its mission? And so if you've got these agents that are replicating human functions, I don't want to say complete jobs, because I think that's far away.
Yeah.
But definitely certain functions of a job. One, they need permission to do those things, right? So let's say if there was a CAPTCHA to access the system because there's a DDoS concern on people brute forcing or something like that, it's an external facing application. Does the agent then do the CAPTCHA, or do you get rid of the CAPTCHA? Is there a different way in?
Yeah.
And then secondly, if it's sentient, will it start developing these capabilities to, there's a CAPTCHA, I know I'm going to have to use one of my tricks to get past that, but it's the right reasons to do my job versus for malicious reason, right?
Yeah.
So where do you see, that extension of, hey, we've got, to modify our like new sign-up workflows or our login workflows, and applying those instead of to humans, which is the normal use case, to an agent, either operator or sentient?
Yeah, I think there's so much opportunity with the operators. Going back to the point of like all the new features that ChatGPT has released on the enterprise.
Yeah,
I feel like you can have a meeting, describe what your product, outcome is going to be, and just let the AI kind of work on it in the background, right? Like have a meeting, talk about what you want, have it ingest those meeting notes, make a product spec, make a tech spec, and then write the code, deploy the code.
Yeah.
And then you're out to lunch. Like it seems like a great workflow in the future of productivity. But how do you govern all those steps along the way if that's the future? I don't think we have the answer today. And I think one of the things I like to look at is we can kind of pivot into MCP a little bit too, and how that fits into this whole picture, because that's going to be a powerful component of the productivity aspect on these AI operators and agentic agents. It's a prompt engineering risk as well as a permissions risk, is what we saw with GitHub, right?
Yeah.
That GitHub incident, I think, was eye-opening for people to slow down on MCP a little bit, because there's so many unknowns on how fast you can move. And it was a combination, right? It wasn't just one particular security flaw in that application or implementation. It was a combination of both.
Well, this is what's really interesting to me. Any AI use case is susceptible to an AI offensive strategy. And the difference between a human hacker trying to break into any type of AI solution or grouped solution where it's multiple parts together operating in some sort of orchestration, is that if you apply AI to it, becomes a brute force permutation attack, where AI can at machine speed find every permutation of pathway through that and connect the dots super quick. And whereas a human has to maybe look at the source code, find a weird nuance that allows a different behavior, unexpected behavior to happen. But MCP, I'd love your opinion on this. I'm going to give you my my riff, and then you can tell me if it's going to be a number one chart topper or useless. So MCP is seen by everybody as the safe protocol. It's like, hey, we want to do agent. Let's do MCP because that's the low risk way of doing agent work. And so, quick definition of MCP: you've got two sides of MCP. You've got the server, which is the group, company, or tool that is providing an interface to its tool or to its capability. That can be multiple tools, multiple capabilities. And it's the defining what you're allowed to do. Here are the capabilities you can use as an MCP client. The MCP client can connect to you, and it can say, what tools do you have? What services do you provide? And then it will have certain ways of translating natural language into the operations that the MCP tool will understand. So an easy example is SQL, right? You've got a SQL database, SQL compliant database. You've got a SQL MCP server that says, hey, you can do select statements. So it's read-only statements, whatever, right? And then that's one tool. It might also have a delete, a cascade, or whatever tool, but let's just stick with select. The client then will have the ability to convert natural language to SQL commands. And so, but it will use an AI model to do that work, because the MCP tools don't have any intelligence built in. They're just a set of kind of rules, prompts, etc. But what happens then is, and a common example that we use internally here is, okay, we've created an MCP server for our database, our SQL database. So that's great. We've created an MCP client that is only allowed to do select statements, only uses that tool. And then we've got somebody who has access to an agent, right? And they say, hey, agent, I want to get all the records of my customers. And let's say you've got, 20 million customers, and they have 10 transactions a day over 3 years. You say, give me all the transactions. And the agent will go and say, hey, AI model, how would I get all all transactions for all my customers? It will create a select all from, a join on customer to transactions. And then that hits your database. The tool will accept that because it's a valid SQL command. It will execute against your database, and you'll have either a DB lock or a huge resource utilization. And so that's the safe use of MCP, right? So that's, already into your example as well, MCP is not safe, needs to be protected, needs to be secured. But also MCP is limiting, very limiting, because you can only do what's being defined by a human being. So if you're curing cancer, you're not going to use the cancer or the medical research MCP server and client.
Right.
You're going to say, agent, go wild. I want you to think of every conceivable combination of chemicals, compounds that will get me this cure for cancer, right? And so I think with MCP, it's a false narrative that it's safe, and it limits the upside, but does not limit the downside. And then the other variation is the sentient model, where there's no MCP or no other protocol. It maximizes the upside, but also maximizes the downside, unfortunately, because there's no security whatsoever.
Right.
So that's my take on it. What about Would you agree or disagree? Or
I think we're in line.
Yeah.
I think where I'd like to see MCP kind of evolve into is sort of the zero trust model,
Okay.
where you're almost denied every action by default, and there has to be a human assistant along the way approving a certain high level set of permissions, right? So it goes into your point of maybe they have access to this one table but not the other, but then the use case eventually flags it and says, I need to grant permission to this workflow or this use case or this operator to gain access to this data for this use case. And there has to be some sort of guardrails and hard guardrails in place to not just let data kind of run wild. I see the same problem happening with like just API creds, right? That's why non-human identity has become this booming market, and there's so many startups trying to solve this problem, because just having an API key will get you access to the entire kingdom, right? Every single PII data, Snowflake, pick your SaaS tool. API keys are the way that I kind of see MCP relating a lot, and how we have to solve those problems in a very similar way. Thinking about how do we instill no permissions from the beginning, define a use case, and grant them by, with a default deny. We've seen this already executed successfully in the cloud. So I'm hoping we can adopt some of that to AI and being able to tie that all in together so that there is a safe path forward to apply and allow the AI to execute on its use case, but in a safe, thoughtful way. So hopefully we can get to that point.
So I think that's a really good perspective from the security side, right? So it's hey, we want things to be beneficial and safe. That's the sweet spot.
But it kills productivity.
Well, no. So I think what it does is it gives everybody a foothold into now AI can be adopted and people can now start getting the benefits.
Yeah.
But then capitalism comes in, as it always does, right? It says, hey, I want to maximize the profitability or the upside. And what's interesting in your cloud example there is really pertinent, because cloud, for its definition and sketchy term that from day one, it was basically either in our region, like i.e. a data center, or maybe multiple regions, but it was a set number of fixed locations that had to be secured. What was dynamic was the access, usability, and operations happening inside the cloud. They were the dynamic elements. So you had static elements that you could get your arms around, like we only operate in 3 regions, great, that's our total attack surface maximized. We then need to understand what's happening inside, who can access what, who's doing what. And we've seen Wiz come in and do a fantastic job and grow to a mega company, right, and then be acquired. So now we go to AI and we say, right, we want to maximize the upside, but we want to keep it safe. The problem with AI is, and this currently it needs the cloud, right? Pretty much, not always, but it needs a model running in a NVIDIA infused data center somewhere. That's dramatically going to change very soon. We've already seen it happen on mobile, right? Nearly every Android and we'll talk about iPhone later, but has a functional model on device.
Yep.
But as it moves out to edge, Teslas have had AI running on device for years, right? So as it moves to a device, and they now start bringing agents on device, so edge agents running with a model that's now on device as well. So there's no call out externally. You now go from a fixed location problem to a unlimited location problem. And the same problems with cloud exist in models. So you've got the things that are happening, who has access to what it has access to, but now you've got it anywhere and then also everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So once you've got that problem, it's really difficult to understand how to protect it. And so one of the proposed solutions is the concept of a bodyguard, right? So you've got, celebrities, if they go out to dinner, they don't go out by themselves. They're going to get mobbed by the crowd. And that's the people having access to them. They could do stupid things that, they don't want the paparazzi to see them doing. That's them doing stupid things, right? And so who do they have with them? If it's not their publicist, it's a bodyguard, right? And that bodyguard's purpose is to hang back, not impact what they're actually doing, but protect them from outside or from them doing stupid things themselves. And so I feel like that's where the security space will get to in the next, I'm going to call it 18 to 24 months, where agents start becoming really efficient. So we've seen BitNet from Microsoft run on device with CPU, no GPU required. That has the ability to power the agent. The agent has a remit and tool access all locally. And so it needs something going with it to protect it being impacted and it causing impact.
So it's a big cycle of what we already saw throughout history.
100%.
Because we started off with computing in mainframes, and we just had these dumb terminals that did nothing, right? And then, okay, now we're going to have really powerful computers in front of us. Laptops and PCs have become the norm. And now we shifted to the cloud. So we went back to the mainframe model, and now we're coming back full circle and having these devices, AI powered across the board. So I think it goes back into sort of the AV EDR aspect, right? What's
interesting? Okay.
Right, you drop an EDR agent on all of your endpoints because you assume compromise, right? You assume the worst. You need that bodyguard, the digital bodyguard. So how do you get a AI bodyguard on all those devices? That's not an agent. It's going to have to be a software deployment.
And then how do you ensure that, engineers hate having any kind of endpoint protections? Like, it's using all my resources. It's
we've heard the same thing with the sidecars on Kubernetes. Everyone just accepts it now, right? As long as it's done in an intelligent way, the daemon sets are kind of table stakes these days, right? And
so this is it might sound far-fetched, but this is where we're going in, I would say, max 24 months, more like 18 months. The progress is so fast. And this brings us back to your point about, point solutions versus a platform. And I think when it kind of hops between the two. So we'll see new capabilities for AI be developed by startups, maybe some big companies. OpenAI seems to be trying to thread that line, both things. They're trying to provide the infrastructure and the applications, which is very interesting. They just went to 10 billion ARR, which is pretty good. I would say, not pretty bad.
But I think that this, like the whole thought process of this basically fleet management that you have to go to is why platforms are so important.
Yes.
Right? Because now when we think about, we're not going to stop making applications that are front-ended by an OpenAI API. That's still, these are all ends, not ors, right? So now as a CISO, CTO, CIO, I need a high-level view of everything going on. Even if it's AI being executed on my mobile devices, maybe it's within Windows, which we know is happening already. How do we get visibility and governance into that? The mobile devices, maybe you're operating a fleet of cars, if you're an Uber or some other kind of mobile manufacturer, trucking, take your pick on that front. But you're going to want that God level view of everything that's going on in the AI space in your ecosystem. Obviously, they're very different use cases and dramatically different, everything spanning from shadow IT to APIs to MCPs and now to end user computing. But I would ideally want to solve the problem in similar ways, right? It's still prompts and responses and observability, right? So now how do we do that at scale in all these different modalities?
Yeah, one really interesting issue with modality is that there's a concept that when you switch modality in AI, currently it's lossy. So if you show an AI model an image and ask it to describe it in text and get that text and say, draw it for me, it'll be very different, right? And so I think that's good. That would be two humans as well. If you gave someone a picture and said, describe it.
It's like the game Telephone when you played it in school.
Yeah, exactly.
The message never was the original.
Never the original, right? Ever. But when you then have, if you think about it from a black hat perspective, right? You're going to say, where are the things it doesn't do a great job? And how can I take advantage of that? And what's the most efficient, that phrase, keep your powder dry, right? What weapon or technique can I use that doesn't expose all my capabilities up front day one? I want to use the simplest, cheapest attack that gets the job done before I expose any other attack techniques that I have. And whilst we see, certainly the MITRE CVE database is at risk, we have, other databases for AI attacks, coming to the fore, MIT, etc. And so there's that, that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. That's just what's happening right now. And so I feel like your point about point solutions being required will hold for quite a while, because each of those different things you spoke about will have different attack vectors. And then understanding those to a deep level is really important, and point solutions are best at that. But then bringing your defensive capability up to par to each one of those requires some sort of consolidation. or at least some sort of ubiquitous format. So back when I worked in Mannion, it was IOCs, indicators of compromise, and that was a kind of an industry adopted mechanism. We have some companies, the company that won the Innovation Sandbox this year, RSA, they have a ubiquitous open source format for identifying threats. So I think we're going to have something like that come to the fore that will hopefully help the cross-pollination of defining, risks or vulnerabilities.
It'd be an extension of the common weaknesses, right? Something like the CWE that we've already seen. I think it's important to standardize, to your point, because now, I don't know if we'll ever get to like signatures, and I hope we don't, right?
Oh God, hopefully not, no.
But there is something powerful to the CVE database, right? To be able to do that at scale, cross technologies, so everyone can talk the same language. So it'd be really interesting to see how that kind of schema takes place. And
so on that interesting question, and I have a kind of, not a hill that I'll die on, but I'll put up a good fight on the hill.
You have a lot of hills.
Yeah, I have a lot of hills, yeah. So if you think about, back in the day, Windows was the 95% OS that you had to protect, right? And then a little bit of Mac, hardly any Unix or Linux, right? Today, if you map that, it's a keep with me here because it's not a great transition, but if you think of the different models, right? Let's go at the Gemma family, the ChatGPT family, Claude, and let's throw in Mistral and Llama. So let's say 5 platforms, and they're all US, Europe. We won't include the Asian platforms yet, right? If you talk about those as OSs instead of models for a second, and you say, right, okay, we've got this common weakness, not signature, but some sort of identifier or terminology or language you can define risks or vulnerabilities. Do you think then that we'll need those to consolidate, or will we be able to use that definition, that language to define risks that equate to those different models or platforms?
Yeah, I think it'll have to be the latter. It'll have to be the same sort of theory around being able to have something that's abstracted beyond just like a specific tactical vulnerability in the model, maybe related back to the OWASP top 10 on AI issues that we've seen.
Yeah.
I think they've done a good job on like having these large kind of ambiguous buckets, but are still rather specific. But the problem is on that, detecting threats in each of those buckets are exponential.
Yeah.
And how do you get granular enough to be able to start like identifying attack tags or IDs or the CWEs? We kind of have to figure that out still. But the abstraction layer for those risks and threats have to be model abstracted, because all those models could be vulnerable at some point. We've talked about it offline in the past of like, as these models advance, they become worse at security, right? And I know you guys have been a big proponent of that. And that's super important to think about, because one model might be vulnerable one day and then not the next, and then vulnerable again after. So how do you keep track of that at a deep level, and then be able to abstract that and report that out in an intelligent way? So
one of the comments I've heard from a lot of people in the security space, and I'd love your take on this, is, hey, it's only prompts, or it's only responses. And only responses is the whole DLP space, right?
Yeah.
So, I think
it's only SQL queries.
Yeah, it's only SQL queries. It's only command line terminal commands, right? But if you think, a journalist once said to me off the record, so I won't quote them, but it was, the attack surface is limited only by the eloquence of the English language, right? And then if you replace the word English in there with any language, because now all of these, right to left language models and character-based language models, etc., you then start realizing how wide the space is, because it's the multiplication of that eloquence of the language multiplied by the verticals or use cases, multiplied by now the tooling that are used for agents, right? And so you've got this, and that's why I always go back to brute force permutation attack. And so there's a case, I think, that sometimes you don't want the fastest response, right? So, people always want everything quicker, cheaper, whatever, right? Better.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder, do you think there's a space here to say, okay, the doors that AI opens up can lead to good or bad outcomes? Should we slow down some of these things to allow for the time to figure out if it's safe or not? It's at the cost of speed, but you still get the outcome that you want, the desired outcome of it solved a problem, or it's doing something without a human being required, etc. Or do you think, no, the world's not going to put up with that. It's just going to go faster. We just as security professionals have to say, We just have to be there to create an environment that's safe to do that in.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's a bit of both. I
Okay.
think what you'll find is that there's going to be some use cases that need immediate action,
Right.
right? Like we need to be first to market in this. We need to be the leading edge. We need to cost optimize. And if we're not doing it yesterday, we might as well not do it. We've seen AI attributed to tons of layoffs, right? So if they were being slow and thoughtful and methodical on how to do that, they probably wouldn't be able to execute on that cost savings for that quarterly earnings.
True.
So that becomes challenging. So it's going to be flying by the seat of your pants when it comes to some of the productivity stuff. And I also think is security going to be involved in the loop of every product implementation? Well, we hope the answer is yes across the board, but in reality, we know that's not practice. People are going to be able to deploy their code without security approval. And they can have all the excuses pushed down from the higher ups to go execute it. So I hope we take a methodical approach on certain use cases, but there's some use cases that you're almost better off just ripping the Band-Aid off and leaning in, and then making sure that you have guardrails and learning from, right? Like fail fast and keep that as a philosophy as you approach it. And maybe you'll get better buy-in with your product folks by saying, go crazy, just use this as the guardrails, and we'll catch you if you fall.
I think that's a good approach. And actually, it leads me to something I want to talk about with you is your opinion on GRC.
Yeah.
Right? So I can't remember my career, I'm not sure about you, but I can't remember anything that moved this fast and this seismically as fast as it's moving. And there's always been kind of break points where GRC could catch up, for want of a better expression, where GRC could say, okay, we've seen what's happened. We understand enough to get our arms around it and put good governance, policies, controls, etc., requirements in. My opinion is that it's moving too fast. There's no breakpoints for GRC to kind of get their arms around it. And so that thing, I think it was an eloquent point you made about, providing the safety net to catch you when you fall, as opposed to saying, here's the rules of the game. If you adhere to the rules, you'll be okay. What's your take on, is GRC feasible, even possible in an AI space when the speed continues at the rate it's going?
I think it will. We've already seen, ISO get released on putting out some AI standards. The EU AI Act is out there already, and we're working on some content for that. So check out our blog.
Oh, interesting. Good. Yeah.
It should be out by the time this video is out. So the way I have to think about it, again, goes to the abstraction layer. I don't think we're going to be very prescriptive with AI. I think as long as we're not trying to get into the weeds and saying this 0 needs to be a 1 and this 1 needs to be 0, that's where we're going to fail and lose, and it's just going to be a terrible process. But what I'd like to see through these acts, and I've seen some of the requirements that allude to a lot of this, is just like, how do you address risk in this AI implementation?
Yeah.
Right? Leave it open-ended, just like AI is open-ended, so that at least the thought process is being put on the angst of the implementer to go through that exercise and think through some of these worst-case scenarios. Think through, how are you addressing bias, right? That's a big part of these regulations as well. How are you putting quality assurance around your AI models? So these, I think, are wide enough paintbrushes that don't allow, the productivity and the speed to, market getting impacted, but it at least makes the implementers think about it like, hey, there are some downfalls and pitfalls to AI that we should be intelligently thinking about, and how we execute that at the technical level is something that's still a bit abstracted. But we should be figuring out what are the kind of flow diagrams of detecting bias in AI and detecting data links in AI. And as long as these broad strokes that are just not really like pass or fail, but it's just like, just have a plan, I think it'll be successful in the GRC space.
What's interesting to me is I view GRC for AI as the rules of golf versus creating a golf course. So the rules of golf are like, if you ever looked at the book, it's way
not
too,
the app.
get the app, but it's super comprehensive, detailed, like almost takes the joy out of golf, right?
Yeah.
And every time one of those rules that's kind of, really pernickety happens in a pro golf tournament that's on TV, everybody complains, it's ruining the game or whatever.
Yep.
But then if you, yeah,
that was just happened this week.
Our poor guy Shane Lowry with the divot, like I feel
Yeah.
bad for that guy, you know. But great golfer, by the way.
Yeah.
We support you, Shane. But the guys who create the golf courses, I feel like they've got it right. They say, here's the course, here's out of bounds, right?
Yep.
Go play. And so if you want to drive for the green, you can drive for the green. If you're, DeChambeau, you can hit for the green. If you want to play it safe, play it safe. The only thing you have to do is not go out of bounds.
Yep.
And so I feel like that's what is required for GRC and AI. Here's out of bounds, here's not. You as the creator, whatever that thing you're creating is, as long as you stay in bounds, you're good. Look for efficiencies, look for operational excellency.
Yep.
But these are no-go areas. These are when you're skiing, if you go over here, we're not going to come search for you, right?
Yeah.
You're on your own.
Yep.
And I think that allows the combination of fast-moving space of, it's not the Wild West, but you can take some risk without getting completely burnt.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I'm working 20 years this year in space, and the Ahab's whale of InfoSec has been auto remediation, Purple Team, like completely autonomous, self-healing platforms, right? So I think that's something that is smirked at a little bit in industry, and rightly so, right? The idea that you can just put a system in place and walk away is, I think, a bit of a silly notion. It's an aspirational notion, but a bit silly in my opinion. With AI, you've got the best effort of humanity today creating a capability that is as close to human action as ever been created before. It's nowhere near perfect. It's nowhere near there, but it's the best we've done so far. Has that moved the needle for you anywhere near auto remediation, or what steps back from that do you think are possible if we can't get to that AI whale moment?
Yeah, auto remediation is definitely an aspirational thing. I'm so glad we've gotten to, in certain technology stacks, places of defense. Yeah. Right. I think about like email security. We have decent phishing detection, right? Not 100%. Think about web application firewalls, decent web application protection, but not 100%. Mm-hmm. Same thing on the EDR front. So now how do we get to a place of AI security and auto remediation? I think number one is a strong foundation that goes back to our earlier points of having this common repository of issues and being able to build defenses against that as sort of the baseline. And then a continuous model that can probe, red team, exploit these models, and then build its own prompts to say, I'm going to defend against that. That's where I like to see we get there. Will the business accept that there's going to be not 100%, attrition rate to those type of detections, and it could lead to false positives? We'll see. There's always been this detect before you block mentality, and I think that's hopefully where we are today in more mature shops. Will we get that across the industry? I hope so soon. So the auto remediation, I think, is something that's very much needed in this space because these attack vectors will be so dynamic in the future, right? We've seen so many different prompts come out that are just like, how does that even work? And why is the model even answering that? You're like, just because these characters are backwards, you're like, oh, I'm going to listen. And it's like, what? That makes no sense to me as a human, but as a machine, it does. And we're just at the beginning of this. I think those prompt engineering techniques are going to be exponential in the next 12 months, 6 months. So how do we defend against that? It has to be AI, fighting fire with fire.
Now, this is something I find, you mentioned shops there, right? So maybe the risk tolerance level of a shop, the operational excellency of a shop, or, somewhere in between. What about managed service providers, right? So typically they always came after the fact. We didn't start security with managed service providers; they came secondary. Yeah. But in some cases, they became really, really excellent because they were seeing such a broad variety of attack across different sectors, verticals, etc. Do you see maybe, those guys adopting auto remediation with human in the loop, of course, first, or do you think you'll see the kind of best-in-class shops independently adopted? What's your opinion there?
I think it's going to be best-in-class shops.
Okay.
Because they'll have a dedicated team of resources that know the implementation very well. Mm-hmm. I think MSSPs will lag slightly behind because if they put in a bad block, it's exponential.
True.
It's not just like one deployment. It's maybe 10,000 deployments,
The
depending on
impact's huge, yeah.
how big your MSSP is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would say these high-class, tier 1 shops in-house, they're probably doing something very mission critical at the highest, Fortune 20, right? If not larger. So I think part of that is going to be just a learning experience for both of them. Something that's needed on both ends.
Time for a really hypothetical out there question.
Okay.
So CISOs are responsible for, the whole circle around the organization, right? As AI becomes further and further and further adopted, not just in the products that your company's offering, but also your internal services and things like that. Yeah, productivity, right? You're more, let's just say vulnerable, for want of a better expression, more vulnerable to other types of impacts that aren't necessarily defined as security. So I'm talking about things like brand damage. I'm talking about things like
viral moments,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm talking about things like OpenAI went down and had an outage today, right?
Yeah.
So if you're building your service on top of them, or an AWS or an Azure, whatever it is, how do you think about the CISO's role changing, right? So now there's this well-defined box that they've always had, and then there's this fuzzy box that's over here, which is kind of nebulous right now and not well-defined. Are CISOs embracing this as a brand new challenge? Are they like, come on, really? Why is that my problem? Where do you think CISOs sit in that whole spectrum?
Yeah. I've had I don't know if it's much of a aha moment this week and last week on this kind of thought process, but the way I plan on framing it in my organization, and I don't think we've done a good job transparently in the past, and I don't know of too many CISOs that have gone through this exercise, but we should start quantifying what a total breach looks like to an organization.
Interesting.
Let's go down the rabbit hole of like everything is compromised, everything is down. What does it look like to involve crisis management, digital forensics firms, outside counsel, crisis management, right? The list goes on of what that total cost of impact would be. And now what you do as a CISO should be saying, every time I ask for budget for a new tool, I'm protecting against the downside of that total breach.
So your incident response is redefined. You're adding some sort of tax or at least coverage on top of all these new...
Yeah, it has to be a bit of a range.
Okay.
Right? Because obviously I hope I never have to respond to an entire, data breach.
Yeah.
But if we're hypothetically processing 10 million records, what's the cost of 10 million records exposed?
That's super interesting, yeah.
Those 10 million records could be a subset and maybe an incident, but like, let's go against what our total downside of what we're protecting against. And it goes down further down the rabbit hole, right? Those are direct costs. What are the reputational damages of having an incident that has compromised 10 million records? What is the stock price implications and investor relations? And like quantify that and put a number on it. And like, this is worst case scenario if we have a breach, right? What does churn occur for a B2B or a B2C business? Both will have churn in this scenario. And now you can start getting a really good quantification of what you're protecting against. And now you can start using that as saying, as long as I don't go above that number, or maybe we could figure out what that benchmark ratio is of like what percentage to total incident costs would be, you'll have, I think, a much better time translating that to the business to get buy-in.
The one point that I thought of when you said that was that I hadn't thought about before. The number of records is interesting because at some point the number of records can then be used to train a Gen AI model to now factor in some sort of USP that your business now used to have, for itself now. So let's say it's a mapping algorithm or a trading algorithm. You can now reverse engineer that. So that understanding the total cost of that breach has completely changed because of AI. Super interesting. Yeah. Thanks a million, Anthony. That's really good.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.